So I've been thinking about where self-improvement advice fails. And I think self-improvement, this whole space, really is interesting. And it's something which, yes, has a lot of what people now call grifters and a lot of bad advice, but it also does include some useful strategies and ideas. How could it not? An entire ecosystem of people trying to improve their lives. It will naturally yield some wisdom. But there's a problem. When we talk about self-improvement, obviously a lot of the notions of self are ill-defined or poorly defined entirely, and sometimes nefarious. People might talk about self-improvement and then they'll just tell you about jelqing. And fine, go and do it if you want. But, well, maybe don't actually. I don't know how safe that is. If you don't know what jelqing is, don't look it up. Seek professional medical help if you're doing anything like that. Anyway, the point is, whilst I like self-improvement, I recognise that there are issues with it. And I don't think it's to be completely lauded all the time. I think some of it's really useful, and some of it is also really nefarious. Some of the people who promote it, if you listen to them, they're kind of sociopaths and are just manipulating people who are genuinely trying to improve themselves. But I think generally speaking, there's a lot of good actors in this space, and I've read quite a few books on the matter that I do find to be quite useful and helpful and interesting, and sometimes really rigorous when you find the right ones. Equally, some are a bit of a waste of time. So that's how I feel about self-improvement. I think it's an ecosystem, it's a space, an industry as well, that does provide a certain amount of information and knowledge which can be really useful. But there's a serious problem with it. And it's one that I have struggled with for many years. And it's only now that my life is really starting to change that I feel a lot of these self-improvement protocols, so to speak, am I able to implement. And it's really made me realise now that after perhaps a decade or so of trying to quote unquote perfect and improve my life in all these different ways, that it's only now that my life really feels like it's changing. And it's not because I've implemented some random strategy that I found online, it's because I've architected my life fundamentally differently. And it's only now that because of that, I can start implementing a lot of these quote unquote, self-improvement protocols in a more serious way. And am I finding them to be useful? And it's interesting because most of the ones that I find to be useful, the strategies, are ones that I myself have experimented with and come up with, routines that I've found that work with me, ways of structuring my time that work for me. And even now, it's really not the advice from so many of these other people online that's helping me. There's of course some, but generally I'm finding that my own self-improvement strategies seem to be the best for me, naturally. They're bespoke, they're tailored to me. But whatever the case, whether they're from your own mind or from others, the fact of the matter is now I'm actually able to implement them, and to a much higher degree than I used to. And my self-control, which is a really key point, seems to be much higher. To use a more technical term, my motivational salience, that is my brain and body's ability to recognize a goal as important, as salient, and move towards it, has really improved. And I like this term because people often talk about motivation and it gets confusing because it sounds like for a lot of people you're talking about just desire. So I have a great desire for things that sound great, and motivation can be, in some people, seen as just that. Whereas then for some people, when they hear the word motivation, they see it as entirely action-led. You can't say you're motivated if you're not doing anything. And so there's a bit of a confusion around motivation. Is it this action-led feeling, or is it just desire? And so I really like this term about motivational salience. I feel like it adds some much needed clarity and confusion to the term motivation. And I think if we remember this throughout the video, it's this idea of optimizing motivational salience specifically. It really helps you understand where my headspace is at and what's helped me. And so specifically, that feeling to recognize and move towards your goals, for me, is at the highest level it's ever been. And it's remarkable because all of a sudden I'm actually able to implement. I say all of a sudden, but really it's obviously years of progress and self-work. But it feels like almost suddenly I'm able to implement lots of protocols and specific strategies and systems. And when I do, I'm able to stick to them, adhere to them much more than I could in the past. And so what I've realized is that, and you have to forgive me if this is an obvious point and not very nuanced, but fundamentally, I think there are two types of people who gravitate towards self-improvement. On the one hand, I would say you have people who gravitate towards it because they're in serious pain and they are trying to remedy it. People who are struggling often more than they recognize consciously and are desperate for a solution. And they're using self-improvement and all these strategies of optimization to just feel normal and alive. And I really can relate to this. Then you have the high performers who, on the other side of the spectrum, who are already producing whatever it is they want to produce. Now, obviously, I say on the other side of the spectrum. It's possible that high performers are also trying to address some inner conflict, but certainly in terms of their behavior, we've got two different groups here. And the high performers might already be achieving largely a lot of what they want, or at least are, through external metrics, performing well in whatever their given disciplines are, because they're already so obsessed with progress and optimization that they're using self-improvement really just as a further extension of that, as a way to further optimize their life. And I do believe, obviously, there are going to be some people in the middle ground here, but I think that when you actually listen to people who talk about self-improvement and people who are really in that space and read a lot of it, they do seem to fill generally one of those two categories quite clearly. Now, I'm not interested in looking at things in a purely binary way. If you look at things through binary goggles, things will appear binary. But I do think there are two prevailing categories here. But obviously, if you're not sure about that, as always, let me know in the comments. I love reading them. So yes, there's a middle ground, but there are generally two people attracted to self-improvement. And it's an interesting dichotomy because these are people coming at it from really different perspectives and life positions. So for me, and often very different material positions and economic positions. So for me, I think where self-improvement advice really fails is specifically in that former group. Because a lot of self-improvement advice, perhaps all of it, minus a few things like the work in, say, psycho-cybernetics, which really talks about positive self-image, which I think probably can in mild ways be incorporated just through pure mental activity and perhaps has a slightly lower barrier to entry, which is why it's such a successful self-help book. But for that former category of people who are desperately trying to solve a problem and are struggling to perform in really basic ways, why self-improvement fails is because it presupposes a level of self-control, of what people might call discipline. And I'm not necessarily crazy about the term discipline because I feel it's been warped and contorted and used for very nefarious ideas where moralistic terms have been, or rather moralistic judgments have been smuggled in. But it certainly is probably apt here. So a lot of the self-improvement advice presupposes a level of self-control and discipline, and what I, as mentioned, would more accurately label as, I think, motivational salience. In other words, a lot of self-improvement advice assumes that the listener, in their current state, is more capable of self-direction than they in fact are. Now, I want to be really careful with how I talk about that, because self-belief and self-image do have a huge impact on what you can do. And this idea that if you believe you can do things, this idea of a growth mindset, it does have a huge impact. And it is, I think, irresponsible to try and tell people and talk to people and convince them that they're incapable. and telling them that they're incapable and they can't do things is a terrible thing to do, because in doing that, you actually do make people less capable. And that is very, very unfair and even cruel if you know the consequences of it. However, there is also a part of the self-improvement and growth mindset crowd who fails to recognize that you have to meet people where they're at. And you may well be incapable at a certain position without the right structure in place of doing certain things. You will be capable at some point of doing all this stuff. But for some people, telling them, for example, not that I think this is a crucial protocol, but just for an example, doing cold baths or showers, cold showers, ice plunges, this sort of thing. You know, if someone, and I have various opinions on this, I think it can be useful acutely, but telling somebody to do that who's seriously depressed and struggling with ADHD management, these are two states which I'll go into more detail, but I think telling someone to do that in those states might be doomed to fail and might in fact stress them out more than it needs to, which is, again, not to say I think there's anything against those things necessarily. I think acutely they can be useful. And obviously it's not necessarily always going to fail when you try and implement these things if you're in one of those states or a wider level of mental distress. But we do see time and time again where people try and implement these various strategies, and I just use those cold showers as an example. But I think it's important to recognize that, and if you look at particularly ADHD management, and this is what I'm talking about, but it's not reserved only for those with ADHD. It's just a good example and applies to a lot of people now. But obviously you don't have ADHD. You don't have to have ADHD to apply any of this. So what do we do then? If I say it's doomed to fail, particularly if you've got these certain sort of mental conditions, well, what am I saying? Is it just a defeatist attitude? If these bits of advice are doomed to fail, how does anyone make improvement? And it might seem like a bleak position. Okay, so you're saying that basically self-improvement doesn't work unless you're already high performing. So then how does this work? This doesn't make any sense. Well, here's the crucial part. There are still things that can improve your life. There are still things that you can take. And I'm not meaning from just these bits of pieces of advice on the internet, although you can still try them. What I'm saying is that people need to be met where they're at and use strategic points of leverage that will result in bigger changes in their life, that will facilitate the kind of growth that will allow for the level of self-control that a lot of these self-improvement individuals presuppose. And that, I think, is so important to recognize. Let's use those two examples I mentioned earlier. Two examples I myself have experienced which completely disallow for the level of self-control that I now experience. And that's why it's interesting for me to talk about, because this isn't just hyperbole. This isn't just hyperbole or me imagining what it's like. I'm talking about having been in depressive states for years, having had poorly managed ADHD, and having been incapable, and having spent years where I have deeply, deeply struggled and have really not managed to do very, very basic things, even just maintain a consistent sleep schedule. And I've been in states where it was very, very dangerous. And I'm now in a place where I can wake up and first thing in the morning, right now, I'm going for a walk and I'm writing. Whilst I'm walking through, I'm doing a voice recording, a new video. And so that's a huge stark change that I myself have experienced. And so it's true that you can go from one to the other. You can wake up with that rich vigor for life, even if you've experienced those terrible, protracted states of distress. So it's of course possible. Personal change can happen, and self-improvement can help. And you can look at all these different pieces of literature and try and take what you can. But in my experience, you're only going to make serious change if you try and attack the biggest points of distress and utilize the biggest points therein of leverage in your life. And honestly, one of the biggest ones, and I know this is, if you're really into self-improvement, potentially controversial. I'm not sure, some people talk more about it, some people don't like it. But it's recognizing and addressing what might be more serious mental health issues first. And self-improvement can in some ways help with that. But I think if you're in a depressive state, or say you've got poorly managed ADHD, and I'm not necessarily saying you have to go on medication, and I'll talk about my thoughts around that, I think, in another video. For context, even though there are still days where I struggle with things, that big change I've spoken about has been done without medication. But I'm not necessarily against medication either. We'll go into that into more detail in another video. Really, what I'm trying to say, what I think one has to do, and what's worked for me, before you start worrying and beating yourself up about all these different protocols and strategies, which is okay to try, especially if they're quite easily implementable and they focus more on mental state changes. But even then, they obviously can be difficult when you're in seriously, severely depressive states or are dealing with some poorly managed mental condition. What you need to do is try and create an environment that will constitute better mental health. Architect the environment that will allow you to become that person. Create a system around you where there's external structure, where maybe in your current state, you're not able to direct yourself completely, so you put it on others, which is a controversial take. And I don't mean, mitigate responsibility. I mean, take responsibility, but as part of taking responsibility, it might be for certain things you need external support. And that could be therapy, which is something that I'm a big proponent of. So cold showers, and all this sorts of stuff. It's absolutely fine if it helps you. But fundamentally, the only thing that's going to drastically change your life is specific courses of treatment. And I mean treatment in the most broad sense, that are targeted at serious issues. I mentioned, obviously, being a big proponent of therapy. I mentioned this in my last video, and I know not everyone likes it, and I know there's lots of different types of therapy, and there is a large degree of finding the right therapy and therapist for you. But this has had a huge impact on my life, and I'd be entirely remiss if I didn't talk about it. You don't have to go to therapy, obviously. It's up to you. But exploring that as an option, for example, and seeing how that might impact your life, I'm a big fan of. One of my favourite types of therapies that has helped me is actually Rogerian therapy, which is referred to as person-centered therapy, which if you're interested in, I might do a video on, but have a look at that if you're interested in, but not sure what sort of therapy to start with. But just finding something that works for you has, for me at least, been tremendous. In line with also doing a lot of journaling for me, and again, this is one of those more self-improvement-y type things that a lot of people might struggle with or not like, but that is one of those protocols, so to speak, that has helped me. But even that, I was only really able to do once I had these big environmental changes, once I had energy. For me, and I mentioned in one of my other videos about capital being energy, and for me, energy is really the most important thing in life, and that's what if I optimize for anything, it's for energy, it's for a will to live. That's the thing that I care about. So obviously, there's also a path of diagnoses and medication, but you don't have to go down that path. And certainly in my experience in England, despite what people say on the internet, no one's actually forcing you to do this. There's been no pressure to do this sort of stuff for me. In fact, there are periods where I kind of wish people were bigger proponents of it and people had suggested it and pushed it more, which is a really controversial take on the internet. But I think that might be because in America, it is pushed and people are diagnosed and medicated too frivolously, whereas in my experience, people who have struggled with things like ADHD, at least in England, have just been never diagnosed until they're much older and they sort of start looking at it themselves. But when I started to get some of these things addressed, there was never any pressure to do any of that. And indeed, I still haven't explored, still haven't done medication myself. Not that I'm against it, it's just not something I've felt I've wanted to do yet. But then perhaps more importantly, aside from the psychiatric treatments, more existentially, more experientially, we are very far removed from a meaningful life. Our goals, our dreams as human beings. I think whilst there's a lot of serious trauma that people go through, and I wouldn't try and flatten the complexity of someone's experience who's in a depressive state or who has a poorly managed mental health condition, there are a lot of people in depressive states and who have poorly managed mental conditions, in no small part just because their environment is truly misaligned with their goals and misaligned with living a meaningful life. Being in school and hating your subjects, not liking your teachers or friends, not having a social network, not having friends, having a job that you hate, not being able to construct your life and your schedule in a way that works for you. And so I think that's why a lot of self-improvement really doesn't work, is because it presupposes a level of self-control. It presupposes, dare I say, a level of mental health and discipline that is hard to unlock if you're in a serious depressive state for whatever reason. And a lot of the people who are obsessed with self-improvement are in fact essentially trying to self-medicate with advice. And it's not working for a lot of them, as it didn't for me. Not because there's nothing to be said about self-improvement or there's nothing to take from it, but because there are deeper, sometimes unconscious, sometimes neurobiological, sometimes structural, both internally and external reasons why you might be feeling a certain way that is desperately in need of addressing. And if you take a moment, if you're interested or even obsessed with self-improvement and you're wondering why it's not working, to have even just a day or an hour or even just 10 minutes if you can't do anything else, to forget most of what you've heard online and ask yourself, how do you genuinely feel? What are the things you're struggling with? Can you focus? Can you sit still? Are you dealing with thoughts that are so dark and depraved that you don't want to share with anyone? What's actually going on? How much control do you even have over your own life? And ask yourself, what can I do right now to take that seriously? And do so without shame or self-flagellation. I think that's why a lot of this isn't done. It's why I've been able to almost suddenly make so much change in my life. The problem with a lot of self-improvement, as much as I do love it in some ways, is that it doesn't take a lot of the serious mental disquiet and the mental distress. And throughout this video, you can swap out mental health for mental distress if you don't like the term mental health. If you look at your mental distress and you take it seriously, you might begin to address some of the more serious ailments that are, or conditions, which might not necessarily be all psychiatric, they could be environmental, but take a look at those which are actually causing you to struggle so profoundly that even self-improvement won't work. It might be that we've just been removed from our goals. So you can begin to address those. And this might be changing jobs. This might be, if you've got some capital, like I spoke about in one of my previous videos, putting capital into high leverage activities. It could be seeking treatment in whatever way you're comfortable with. It could be light self-improvement work. It could be different environments, whatever it is, therapy. Or if it's a tiny thing and you just can't really do anything because you're basically catatonic, well, then you can ask yourself, what's the smallest thing that you know that you can do to start addressing your mental state and improving how you feel about the world and giving you back your energy piece by piece? And fortunately or unfortunately, that might take you down a deeper and more self-reflective and one day much more intense path than a lot of the self-improvement advice you get online. But it also might just save your life, just as it did me. So thank you very much for watching this video. As always, if anyone watches this long, you're an absolute trooper. I'm absolutely loving making videos. It's so much fun for me. This is a perfect example of the kind of thing that gives me back energy, that makes me feel good, that improves my mental state, and that directs me towards activities that I find meaningful, creative pursuits. I like writing. I am sometimes sick of hearing my own voice, but I do enjoy the process of recording, and it's fun to share, even if it's just to the void, these various thoughts on things, particularly when they're somewhat spontaneous. I mentioned in my last video at the end that, for many years I didn't do anything like this because I was worried about it not being perfect. So this is part of my own protocol to lower my inhibitions and train myself to just put myself out there. And I'm absolutely loving it, even if you think this is an absolute stinker of a video, which I can appreciate. So thank you very much for watching. If you want to see more videos, reprimand that subscribe, decimate the like button. But more importantly, if you have thoughts on this, if you have opinions on self-improvement, how it works, how it doesn't work, how you've found ways to address issues in your life, your opinions on therapy, your opinions on the sort of advice you get on the internet, I'd love to hear it. These, especially if you've watched this long, you probably have quite a good idea now of how my brain works and how I process information. And I would love to hear your thoughts on the subject. So yes, if you stay this long, comment. I'll see them all. I'll try and respond to all of them. Massive respect for you to watching this long. So without further ado, I'll have to say for now, peace out.